This video is to help you understand decimals. Decimal numbers are numbers that allow you to write very precise values. For example, in a race, in a running track, there is a very small amount of difference in the time between someone that comes in first place and someone that comes in second place, and that's usually a fraction or a part of a second. So decimals represents part of a whole. That's what decimals represent. Here's another example of when we use decimals, and it's to use to represent a part of a whole. You see some change here, 25 cents, a dime, a nickel, and a penny. And this is not a whole dollar, it's part of a dollar. If we added it together, it would be 25, 35, 41 cents. So I would write that 0.41, and I would talk about that as 41 cents. I'd want to use the dollar symbol in front of the decimal if I use the decimal. But this is showing part of one whole, and that's what a decimal represents. Here's another way of looking at it. If you look at these large squares and think of this as one whole, this one is broken into 10 equal parts, or 10 strips, if you can tell. Each of those 10 parts is called 1/10 of the whole square. And you'll notice here I have 3 out of 10 shaded, 3/10 shaded, or 3/10. Make sure you can see that decimal. That's how I would write it as a decimal. Likewise, this is another whole square. It's broken into smaller parts. There are 100 small squares inside it. So each of these squares is called 1/100th of the large square, and so part of this square is filled in as well. And I know that each of these rows is, or columns, is 10, so that's 10, 20, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37 hundredths are shaded in, or 37 out of 100 squares, and you represent that as a decimal as 37 hundredths, 0.37. I know this is difficult to see, but look at these number lines. This number line just takes us from 0 to 3. But again, a decimal is a part of a whole. So here is 0 and here is 1. And this decimal place, or this point on this number line, is between 0 and 1. So it's not a whole, it's not quite one whole. And if I count over, this is broken into 10 equal parts, which makes these little segments here between these lines tenths. And if I count over, I've got 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, 4/10, 5/10, 6/10, 7/10, 8/10. This point here is represented in 8/10, not quite one whole. Now, I have another point over here, and it's between 2 whole and 3 whole. And it's, again, tenths, so I can count. This is 2 1/10, 2 2/10, 2 3/10, 2 4/10, and I write it like this. We'll talk more about how to write decimals here in a moment. Now this one is difficult to see, but this is just a number line that's kind of more, we shrink it down, and this is just from 0 to 1 whole. So from 0, this is 1 whole, this whole number line. It's broken into smaller parts. It's broken into tenths, and then each of those tenths is broken into tenths, so that means that there are 100 segments on this number line. And so this point here is over 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 61, 62, 63 hundredths, and that's another way to represent a decimal. But again, notice it's part of a whole. It's not 0, it's not 1, it's in between them. This isn't 2, this isn't 3, it's in between 2 and 3. And in this case, it's 2 4/10. Okay, reading decimals properly. It's important to be able to read them properly. Now, I'm going to provide a place value chart for you, but we can look at this place value chart. Now, what I have represented right now are the whole numbers. Anything to the left of the decimal is a whole number, and so this is 207. And to read this one properly, I would read it as 468,152. But notice, I'm going to remove this, and you are going to see that those are decimal places. And so to read this decimal, this is part of a whole, it's 136 thousandths is how I would read that, 136 thousandths. To read this full number, it's 207 and 25 hundredths. And to read this full number with the decimal included, it's 468,152 and 59 thousandths. Notice every time I come to the decimal, I say the word and. So we read the decimal point as and. Now again, you need to know how to read this chart properly, and I am going to provide one, but you also will be expected to memorize the chart by a certain date. But anything to the left of the decimal is a whole number, and anything to the right is part of a number. So I could put, since there's nothing here in the ones place, I could put a 0 there, and that would be read 0 and 136 thousandths, or I can just call it 136 thousandths. Now, talking about when I read these properly and so forth, the number 207 and 25 hundredths is actually a number that's more than 207, but not quite 208. So it's a part of a number between 207 and 208. 136 thousandths is a number between 0 and 1. It's not 0, it's more than 0, but it isn't one whole either. And 468,152 and 59 thousandths is a number that's between 468,152 and 468,153. Okay, now we have three different forms that we talk about with decimals. We have word form. Being able to read it properly is really important, because if you can read it properly, you can write it properly. And we use this to write it fractions later on too, so reading it properly is very important. Then we have standard form, which is just your basic form, and then we have expanded form. So this one, 136 thousandths. You read it, just read the number, and then look at where the last digit lands, what position it lands in, and that's how you know what you call it. 136 thousandths. This one is 25 hundredths. And this one is a 0 here, but we don't say 0 and. We don't say and at all, actually. It's just 59 thousandths. Now, if I had a number in front of here, like, oh, let's put a 6, then that is 6 and 25 hundredths. Now, let's look back at the 136 thousandths. Notice I say the THS at the end. It's almost like I'm lisping. I'm just saying that very distinctly, because tenths are different than tens, and hundredths are different than hundreds, and thousandths are different than thousands, and so forth. So, 136 thousandths is word form, THS at the end. Standard form just looks like this. It's what we saw in the chart. And expanded form looks, you just look at it by, place value place by place value place. In other words, there's a 1 in the tenths place, so I can write it as 0.1, and there's a 3 in the hundredths place, so I can say that's plus 0.03, because the hundredths place is the second position to the right of the decimal, and there's a 6 in the thousandths place. So since this thousandths place is in the third position to the right of the decimal, I can write that as 0.006. So this is called expanded form. If I wanted to write 25 hundredths in expanded form, I would say, well, there are 2 tenths, and there are 5 hundredths. And so that's how I would write 25 hundredths, in expanded form. And if I were to write this one in expanded form, it would be, there are 0 tenths, so I don't need to write that. There are 5 hundredths, so it would be 0.05 plus, and there are 9 thousandths, 0.009. That would be 59 thousandths in expanded form.